Alessandro Velluto was not born into power. He built it from the shadows, turning the chaos of Sicily into a criminal empire so flawless that it outlived him, and so secret that even his disappearance became the most dangerous mystery in Mafia history. Alessandro Velluto was born on a damp October morning in the heart of Palermo, a city of cobblestone streets, crowded markets, and restless whispers. His family owned a small olive farm on the outskirts where the land rolled gently toward the sea. Life there was simple but harsh. The soil demanded backbreaking work, the weather was unpredictable, and the few coins his father earned never seemed to stretch far enough. Yet Alessandro grew up with sharp eyes and a mind that wandered far beyond the boundaries of the farm. While other children played in the fields, he lingered in the marketplace, watching men bargain over sacks of grain or barrels of wine, memorizing every gesture and every hesitation. He noticed that money changed hands in two ways, through honest trade or through quiet arrangements that were never written down. It fascinated him how a handshake could mean more than a contract, and how a lowered voice could decide the fate of an entire shipment. By the age of 10, he understood that power wasn't just about owning land or goods, it was about controlling the flow of trust and fear. In those days, Sicily was a land without balance. Political power shifted constantly, and the few officials who remained in office were often more corrupt than the criminals they were supposed to fight. Bandits roamed the countryside, robbing merchants and farmers without consequence. Judges could be bought for the price of a single gold coin, and police patrols often turned their backs if the bribe was generous enough. For most people, survival meant accepting this chaos and keeping their heads down, but Alessandro saw an opening in the disorder, a gap where a man with vision could step in and quietly take control. His first steps into that world were small and almost invisible. When he was 17, he began arranging protection for a handful of merchants who feared traveling the road to Palermo's port. Alessandro didn't carry a sword or a gun, he carried information. He knew which days the bandits preferred to strike, which villages harbored thieves, and which soldiers could be convinced to escort a caravan for a little extra pay. At first, the merchants saw him as a helpful young man, but Alessandro was already charging small fees for his advice, and if anyone refused to pay, he made sure their goods never reached the market in one piece. The transformation from helpful guide to calculated organizer happened quickly. Within 2 years, Alessandro had a small group of men who worked only for him. They weren't crude thugs but disciplined enforcers who followed his instructions exactly. They wore no uniforms, but everyone in the markets recognized them. Their presence meant safety for those who paid and ruin for those who didn't. The merchants didn't realize it at the time, but they had stopped paying for protection. They were paying for permission to do business at all. Alessandro's methods were unlike those of the street gangs that plagued Palermo. He discouraged open violence, believing it drew too much attention from the authorities. Instead, he relied on quiet intimidation and selective generosity. If a shopkeeper delayed payment, he might receive a friendly visit from 2 of Alessandro's men who helped repair a broken door or replace stolen goods. A week later, the same shopkeeper would find himself paying double, grateful to have such reliable protectors. Alessandro understood that fear worked best when it was wrapped in the appearance of kindness. He also learned to build loyalty in ways that couldn't be bought with coins alone. During the winter storms of 1895, when flooding destroyed half the crops in the region, Alessandro personally arranged for food to be distributed in the hardest-hit neighborhoods. The sacks of grain came from merchants who owed him favors, and every delivery carried his name. People began to speak of him not as a criminal, but as a man who could be trusted to keep order when no one else would. By the time he turned 20, Alessandro had expanded his reach far beyond the market stalls of Palermo. His men were stationed in small towns along the coast, and caravans bound for the capital rarely moved without his approval. He had no official title, no government authority, yet every decision about trade, security, and territory passed through him first. The chaos that once allowed thieves and corrupt officials to thrive was now bending to a single will. Even those who hated him admitted that life under Alessandro's quiet rule was safer than before. There were fewer random robberies, fewer senseless killings, and far more predictable outcomes for those who followed his unspoken rules. But beneath that surface stability was something new, something dangerous. a system where every favor owed, every debt unpaid, and every whisper of disloyalty fed into Alessandro's growing power. He was no longer a farm boy watching the marketplace from the shadows. He was becoming something else entirely, a man who understood that real power was invisible and that the right mixture of fear, respect, and obligation could control more than any weapon ever could. What no one yet realized was that Alessandro Velluto was quietly inventing a structure that would one day span continents and outlive its creator. The first threads of the Mafia were already woven into the streets of Palermo, and they all led back to him. Alessandro Velluto's influence began to spread like ink on parchment, slow at first, then unstoppable. What started as a handful of loyal men in Palermo grew into a network that reached across Sicily. Each new town was carefully chosen, each leader personally selected. Alessandro never allowed random recruits. He searched for men who understood discipline, who could follow orders without question, and enforce rules without hesitation. These chosen few became his caporegimes, a word he invented to mark their rank. It was a title that carried both privilege and danger. The system he built was simple in appearance, but complex in design. Every caporegime controlled a territory, collecting payments from merchants, overseeing shipments, and ensuring the streets remained free of competing gangs. They answered directly to Alessandro, bypassing the confusion and corruption of local authorities. Information flowed upward, decisions flowed downward, and nothing happened without his knowledge. In a land where loyalty was often bought and sold, he created a chain of command that was bound by fear and respect rather than paper agreements. Alessandro enforced three unbreakable rules. Loyalty was to him above all else, even above blood family. Silence was mandatory. No one outside the organization was to know its workings, and respect, both given and received, was the foundation of every exchange. These rules were not suggestions. The first man to break them simply vanished. Whispers spread that his body was buried in an olive grove outside Monreale, though no one dared to confirm it. The message was clear. Loyalty was life, betrayal was death. Under this system, street crime began to change. Petty theft and random acts of violence became rare, replaced by organized and predictable control. Merchants no longer feared being robbed by strangers. Instead, they paid their dues to Alessandro's men, who ensured their goods arrived safely. Even those who hated him were forced to admit that his order brought stability. Some officials began to see his organization as a solution to the chaos they themselves could not control. A few even sought his help in dealing with violent outlaws, unknowingly feeding the strength of the very man they feared. His power was not in how many men he commanded, but in how invisible his hand appeared to be. In public he was rarely seen with his caporegime. He did not strut through the streets like a conqueror. He preferred quiet walks in unremarkable clothing, yet behind the scenes, he dictated the flow of money, goods and influence across the island. A single word from him could shut down a port shipment, double the price of grain, or remove a rival from existence. The structure he created was built to endure. If one caporegime fell, another stepped in immediately, trained to operate exactly as before. No territory was left leaderless, no trade route left unprotected. Alessandro thought in decades, not days. He knew that violence drew attention, but consistency built empires. His men learned to settle disputes before they turned bloody, to intimidate with presence rather than bullets. When punishment was unavoidable, it was swift, unseen, and final. As his network solidified, outsiders began to notice that Sicily's underworld was no longer a patchwork of competing gangs, but a single silent machine. From Palermo to Catania, the same rules applied, the same payments were collected, and the same name was spoken in low voices. Even the bandits who had once thrived in the lawless countryside found themselves either joining his ranks or vanishing altogether. By the turn of the century, Alessandro Velluto had achieved what no one else dared attempt. He had turned scattered, chaotic crime into an organized system that functioned with the precision of a military force. His name did not appear in any official records, yet every significant transaction in Sicily seemed to pass through his invisible hand. In the shadows of the island's narrow streets, the foundation of the Mafia, as the world would come to know it, was already complete, and at its center stood a man whose control seemed unshakable. The rise of Alessandro Velluto did not go unnoticed. For years his system had swept aside smaller gangs and silenced petty criminals, but one man refused to be absorbed into his order. Enrico Bartoli was the opposite of Alessandro in every way. Where Alessandro preferred quiet control, Enrico thrived on chaos. He led a loose band of ruthless outlaws who thrived on open violence, burning homes, robbing travelers in daylight, and killing without hesitation. His methods were crude but effective, and his reputation for brutality made entire villages cower at the mention of his name. At first Enrico ignored Alessandro's growing reach, confident that no man could control the wild countryside where his men roamed. But as Alessandro's Caporegime spread into more towns, the bandit leader began to feel his territory shrinking. Merchants who once paid him for safe passage were now turning to Alessandro's system. Even some of Enrico's own allies were tempted by the stability and profit that came with joining the organized network. To Enrico, this was an insult, and a challenge that could not go unanswered. The attacks began suddenly. Caravans under Alessandro's protection were ambushed, their goods stolen or burned. Entire villages that paid Alessandro's men were set on fire as warnings. Several Caporegimes were found dead along deserted roads, their bodies left on display as trophy. Enrico wanted to show that no amount of quiet organization could stand against raw, unrestrained violence. But Alessandro did not respond with open battle. He had built his power on patience and precision, and he refused to be drawn into a fight on Enrico's terms. Instead, he began a silent war, one fought with information, money and manipulation. He learned the names of Enrico's suppliers and paid farmers to poison their grain before it reached the bandit. He bribed small-town officials to arrest anyone connected to Enrico's operations, using obscure charges that kept them locked away without trial. Alessandro also understood the value of rumor. His men spread carefully crafted lies about Enrico, stories of betrayal within his ranks, whispers that certain lieutenants were secretly meeting with Alessandro's Caporegimes. The paranoia began to take hold. Enrico's band grew smaller, not through battle but through distrust. Men deserted in the night, fearing they would be the next target of their leader's suspicion. Over the months, the pressure mounted. Enrico could no longer rely on the steady flow of supplies and gold that had once kept his men loyal. The roads became dangerous for him, every stranger a possible spy. Even the villages that had once sheltered him began turning him away, afraid of Alessandro's quiet but certain retribution. The end came not in a grand confrontation but in a single calculated betrayal. One of Enrico's closest lieutenants, a man he had known for years, approached Alessandro's men with an offer. In exchange for a promise of safety, he revealed the location of Enrico's camp, deep in the hills. Alessandro sent a small, silent team. No gunfire was heard, no witnesses remained. By morning the camp was abandoned, its fires cold, its leader gone without a trace. Enrico Bartoli's name faded quickly from the streets of Sicily, but the message his disappearance sent was lasting. Alessandro had shown that brute force could be dismantled without a single public fight. He had proven that the real power did not come from the size of one's army, but from the ability to control the invisible threads that kept an enemy alive. In this victory, Alessandro's authority became absolute. No rival would again dare challenge him so openly, and the silent war became a defining chapter in the rise of the man who had reshaped Sicily's underworld. By 1910, Alessandro Velluto's reach stretched far beyond the shores of Sicily. Immigrants carried his methods to America, where the same system of control took root in the crowded streets of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. Across the ocean, men who had once served under him now commanded their own territories, mirroring his rules, his structure, and even his unspoken code of silence. In Sicily, his organization ran so smoothly that it seemed untouchable. To many, Alessandro had become less of a man and more of a presence, an unseen force shaping the flow of money and power. Yet as his empire grew, Alessandro himself became harder to find. He no longer appeared in the markets, or attended discreet gatherings in the back rooms of taverns. Meetings with Caporegimes were held in isolated villas, often in the dead of night. His public image shrank to whispers and stories, and some claimed they hadn't laid eyes on him in years. Those who were closest to him noticed subtle changes. He grew quieter, less trusting, and increasingly secretive about his movements. Some thought he feared betrayal, others believed he was simply protecting himself from the growing influence of the authorities, who had begun taking a greater interest in his operation. Despite his absence from public view, his control never faltered. Payments arrived on time, disputes were settled swiftly, and rivals disappeared as efficiently as ever.
But then, without warning, everything shifted. One spring morning, two of his most trusted lieutenants arrived at his secluded villa for a scheduled meeting. The gates were closed, the heavy wooden doors locked from the inside. When they finally forced their way in, they found the scene unsettling. A half-eaten meal sat on the dining table. A small fire still burned low in the hearth. A gold ring, his distinctive family crest, rested neatly on the arm of his chair. But Alessandro himself was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no blood. It was as if he had simply stepped out for a walk and never returned. The villa's servants, who lived in a separate building on the grounds, claimed they had heard nothing unusual during the night. The last anyone had seen of him was the evening before, when he dismissed them early with a wave of his hand. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that he had been betrayed by his own men, quietly removed so that others could take his place. Others believed the authorities had finally caught him, spiriting him away in secret to avoid a public trial that would expose too many powerful names. A more romantic tale claimed he had grown tired of the life he had built and fled to Argentina under a false identity, living out his final years as a simple farmer. No theory was ever proven. Without a body, there was no confirmation of his death, and without his presence, there was no certainty of his survival. The organization he created did not crumble in his absence. Instead, it continued exactly as before, each caporegime carrying out their duties as though nothing had changed. The machine Alessandro had built was so well designed that it no longer needed its creator to function. Over time, Alessandro Velluto became a figure of legend. His disappearance was told and retold in bars, prisons, and back rooms around the world. Some swore they had seen him years later, sitting alone in distant cafes, or walking along deserted docks at night. Whether these sightings were real or imagined, they kept his story alive. The truth was buried in silence, just as Alessandro would have wanted. And in that silence, the shadow of the man who invented the Mafia continued to stretch across continents, his influence lingering long after his name had vanished from the streets.